morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Today's program will be focusing on Tahrir Square and the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring 10 years on, looking back and looking ahead. If you'd like to submit some questions to our panelists, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, and we hope to get to as many of your questions as possible. Our panelists today include Linda Robinson, Director at RAND Center for Middle East Public Policy, Timothy Kaldas, Non-Resident Fellow at the Tahrir Institute Middle East Policy, Professor Paul Amar, Director at the Center for Global and International Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Maryam Czar is our moderator today. She is an LA City Commissioner on the status of women. Maryam, it's so great to have you back moderating one of our programs.
It is absolutely a pleasure to be here again. Thank you, Kim, for giving me this opportunity, and my thanks, as always, to the LA World Affairs Council and Town Hall for these programs and the ability to talk about global issues.
Thank you for your time today, Maryam. Let me turn this over to you without further ado.
Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you, Jessica. I see our guests populating now. Welcome, everyone. So I'm going to start us off by giving a little bit more of a robust introduction of our guests so that our listeners know exactly who they're hearing from. And then we'll go into the series of questions that I have for you this morning. We'll start with Linda and we'll go through, and then we will also take some audience questions that I'm sure will percolate quite quickly as we go through this conversation. So I welcome you all. Linda Robinson is the Director of the Center for Middle East Policy and a senior international defense researcher at RAND. She co-authored Modern Political Warfare, Current Practices and Possible Responses, which was one of RAND's most downloaded publications of 2018. She is currently leading a study of future warfare, including informations, cyberspace, and special operations. Linda has published 15 RAND studies and 4 trade books and has been a visiting fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Johns Hopkins, the Wilson Center, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Linda has advised military commanders and conducted field research on 5 continents and was formerly the senior editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. Welcome, Linda. Dr. Paul Amar is a political scientist and anthropologist who speaks 7 languages and has published in 9 languages. He's currently the director of the Orfalea Center for Global and International Studies and professor at the Department of Global Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He has been awarded 2 Fulbright fellowships and has worked as a journalist in Cairo, a police reformer and sexuality rights activist in Rio de Janeiro, and as a conflict resolution and economic development specialist at the United Nations. His book, The Security Archipelago, was awarded the Charles Taylor Award for Best Book of the Year in 2014 by the American Political Science Association. His other published books include Cairo Cosmopolitan, New Racial Missions of Policing, Global South to the Rescue, Dispatches from the Arab Spring, which is what brought him here, and the Middle East and Brazil. Welcome, Professor Amar. And Timothy Kaldas is a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy and a regular contributor to Bloomberg Opinion. His work focuses on Egyptian political economy, regime strategy, and foreign policy. After spending the last 12 years living and working in Cairo, he has recently moved to Barcelona to pursue a PhD at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Timothy's time in Egypt covered the waning years of the Mubarak rule, the uprising that overthrew him, Egypt's brief democratic opening, and the counter-revolutionary coup, as well as President Sisi's consolidation of power, all of which we will touch on today, I'm sure. Welcome, all of you. So, Linda, I'm going to start us off with you. I'm going to ask you to frame the conversation for us, in fact. Take a look back at the last 10 years and give us an introduction, first of your work at RAND, and frame for us the last 10 years of protest, proxy wars, and the currently ongoing movement fueled by young people across Arab lands.
Thank you so much, Maryam. And it is a delight to be invited to speak at the World Affairs Council, which is a very important venue for Americans to discuss international affairs. I've been honored to speak at councils around the country. This is my first time with the Los Angeles Council. The 10 years since the Arab Spring have been in essence a lost decade for the Middle East. I'd like to offer just a very brief report card that illustrates the worsening political, economic, and social conditions in the region. Repressive states have put more activists in jail than since the Arab Spring began. The Middle East now has more people living in poverty than anywhere in the world, both in absolute terms and as a percentage of its population. The region exceeded Latin America in this regard 4 years ago. Youth unemployment is the highest in the world at 27%. This is a major warning sign as the region's population is one of the world's youngest, with 60% under the age of 25. Women and girls face more gender exclusion from opportunity and the lowest rates of labor participation. There's a severe mismatch between skills in the job market and unfavorable climate for private sector entrepreneurship and the highest public sector employment rates in the world. As oil revenues decline, the bargain of public sector jobs in exchange for quiescence has broken down, likely permanently. And on the political front, just briefly to summarize, since the 2011 massive protests enabled by social media raised hopes for transformation in the region, these hopes have been largely dashed, except for Tunisia. Authoritarian rules returned in Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Yemen have descended into protracted civil wars, which have been greatly complicated by military intervention on behalf of the antagonists by Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and others. There is, however, something of a second Arab Spring that occurred in 2019, which brought changes of government in Sudan, with Omar al-Bashir's ouster after 30 years, with an important role played there by women, and in Algeria, where people rejected Bouteflika's attempt to stand for a fifth term. Mass protests have also shaken Lebanon and Iraq deeply. Since then, of course, the pandemic has suppressed much of the street activity, but in my assessment, not likely permanently. I've spent quite a lot of time in Iraq, and I believe the youth of that country are unwilling to tolerate the sectarian corruption and failed policies of the past. Tragically there, over 500 protesters were killed by armed militias and security services who were ill-trained in crowd control. And Lebanon finally is in the vortex of a triple crisis of governance, economic insolvency, and popular rejection of the conventional governing model. So that does paint a picture, I think, that is quite grim. And frankly, there is little reason at this point to believe that if governments continue with repression and dysfunction, the tumult will continue. Right now, we're in a major period where the pandemic and oil price drops have renewed kind of a clarion call to these governments that a new social contract is necessary if they're to avoid the grim future that these statistics paint. So Maryam, back to you.
Thank you so much. That was quite a bit of information. So it is your opinion that that without any serious reforms or some sort of serious attention paid to wobbling economies and lack of opportunity, that this kind of tumult will continue?
The trajectory that the region is on with its socioeconomic picture and the demographics, I really can't emphasize enough, this is the youngest population in the world, and that essential bargain of statist economies giving jobs in exchange for unrepresentative governance has, I think, fundamentally broken down. Of course, the question is, does it steer into a period of renewed tumult and protest, repression and death, or do the governments begin to realize that they have a stake in a different path forward? And we'll talk more a little bit about where I think U.S. policy has to adjust to try to help the better of those two courses be realized.
Excellent, thank you. I do want to pronounce this idea, the second Arab Spring in 2019, very much was fueled in Lebanon and in Iraq by young people. So that was glaringly true. Okay, so Dr. Amar, turning to you, please give us an introduction of not only your work, but your personal experience in the region and your sense of burgeoning reforms that you saw in their nascent form at the close of 2011 protests, and which ones you can say have lasted in some form.
Great, thanks so much, Maryam. I'm so happy to be here. It's a great honor to be invited to the World Affairs Forum, and thanks to Jessica and Kim and Claire. So I'm so glad that we're all remembering this period in 2010, 11, and 12, and looking to the future, and in the context of an opportunity in which we can really reinvigorate connections between those of us who are scholars or social justice activists or art makers and cultural critics who can really connect with the dynamism that's happening still in the Middle East and amongst people like us that have been spread out around the world since the coups and counter-revolutions after the Arab Spring. So just quickly, you did a great introduction there, so just to situate myself a little bit. So in the years before the uprisings of 10, 11, and 12, you know, I had first left the United States to go to film school in Cairo. My love for Egyptian movies, as you can see all around me, is my first passion. And but I dropped out of film school to become a journalist because the neighborhood I was living in Cairo was being constantly attacked by police. And you know, one of my best friends had actually been captured and tied down to his bed, and they poured gasoline on him and lit him on fire. And after that experience, I dropped out of film school and started to become a journalist in order to cover these kind of community movements, particularly around violent policing. So then leaping forward to 2010, just to remind us, you know, in the United States, of course, we're celebrating Black History Month. We're remembering the amazing uprisings that happened last year around policing, around racism, often led by incredible feminist leaders, led by community activists, that really transformed the way we talk about not just protests, but about political organizing, about outreach, about our bodies, about public space. So thinking in that frame, that's in the way a lot of people in Egypt and Tunisia were thinking about their own fates and their own problems in a very similar way to how we were thinking in June and July of last year during the George Floyd protests. So taking us back to the 2010, you know, in June 2010, a young man who was at an internet cafe, remember those days before smartphones, when in order to connect with the internet, if you were not in the elite, you would go to internet cafes and sit there and do your work and maybe you know, you're socializing or you're gaming. And that was very, very popular. But you had to go through these police bribery lines, often to get in and out of the cafes, as you would sometimes to get into other public spaces or even to get to on the bus sometimes. And so at some point, this guy, Khalid Said, refused to pay the bribes to go to the internet cafe. And he was beaten to a pulp, tortured on the street right in front of everyone, and until he died. And pictures of this spread throughout Egypt and started a movement against police brutality in Egypt that continued starting that June and culminated in the protests on January 25th, which happened, if anybody remembers, the 25th of January 2011 was the government's Love the Police Day in Egypt. It was an official day in which you're supposed to express your love for the police in public commemorations, and activists took advantage of that to start what became a revolution. In the 17th of December in 2010 in Tunisia, a similar event, Mohamed Bouazizi, a very poor street vendor in the south, you know, speaking of unemployed people and of the growing gap between the rich and the poor, this was a street vendor, you know, trying to scrap together a living for his family, who was harassed and abused by police. And in his humiliation, he set himself on fire, and that was videoed and spread throughout the internet, starting the revolution in Tunisia. So, you know, instead of thinking of the Middle East as a very distant and different place, I think we can really identify with what we've been going through in the United States in the past year, and what they were going through and what they continue to go through in these contexts of heavy repression and police brutality, and both working class, poor, young people struggling against these frames. So I know I'm talking too much, but just to shift one little term here, we talk a lot about those times as times of protest, but I think it's more useful to think about them as times of organization, of reorganizing how people think about public space, how they think about gender, femininity, and masculinity in public, how they think about relationships between Christians and Muslims, rich and poor. I mean, it was phenomenal the way the space was, of those months and those 2 years were not just protests against authoritarians. That metaphor becomes self-defeating imagination. But there was times in which amazing innovation of organization happened. People threw out the police from their police stations up and down across Egypt, and they made their own new versions of participatory security. Sometimes that was taken over by awful mafias, but a lot of times it wasn't. Women leading security committees, students leading community protection committees, accountable, not scary, open. Then there was social media reforms and ways that social media became a space, open. First time it was being used in Arabic consistently, not in English, open to more people. They were taking vans and roaming throughout Cairo in order to have TV news and YouTube broadcasts from the working class slums of Cairo, where people could make their own new TV news from places that had never been able to make news before. Women taking over their factories where they were making garments under sweatshop conditions. There were 3 republics run by women factory workers across Egypt that ran their own cities based upon factories run by women who took over. And this list goes on and on. I particularly studied the anti-sexual harassment movements and the anti-sexual assault movements, which remade how women could access public space without violence, how they could, on their own terms, not by asking the police to protect them, but on their own terms and leadership. So those kind of organizations that we see popping up in Lebanon last year, in Iraq in 2018, similar things popping up all around. It's not protests, but it's reimagining the body, the public, the civil sphere in a really brilliant way. It's really democracy from the grassroots up.
Very interesting. Thank you. First of all, I do want to say that reimagining might emerge as a theme in this conversation by the time we're done. But it's interesting that the reforms or the gains made that you can recognize are not on a grand scale where we hear about it in national news, but really nitty-gritty changes on the ground that impact people's lives. And that's great to hear. Turning to you, Timothy, I have a feeling there was a little bit in that commentary that you'd like to pick up on, but turning to you, I want you to please give us a glimpse of what you saw in Cairo. You were there for quite a while, but also as you observed other Arab cities embroiled in, I will not say protest, and embroiled in various movements. And, you know, tell us how those populations are still plugging for incremental change. And I want you to please also touch upon the value of the voice, right? The value of a simple protest in the Arab world and the reaction of governments to that voice of people, right? You know, does it always have to be an event that has to be combated by the government, or can it just be, you know, like Professor Amar is saying, an exercise of the voice of the Arab people, of populations in their own land?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, and it's great to be on the panel with all of you. I mean, that's a pretty broad topic. I would start by saying that, I mean, during the initial uprising, the initial 18 days, there was, I mean, it was pretty a remarkable sense of cooperation, as Professor Amar was referring to. There was a lot of creativity happening. There was a lot of artwork being produced in the square. There was a lot of collaboration, and there was a lot of hopefulness about where this could take things. And the overthrow of Mubarak on the 11th of February, like, was a very euphoric moment for a lot of Egyptians. Random people were hugging me. It was and my roommate, and we were just kind of all I mean, we've been hoping for it, and when I think even like convinced that it had to happen at that point, but it still was shocking when it did. And it was a powerful catalyst throughout the region. I mean, the Tunisians kicked it off with the removal of Ben Ali, which certainly convinced Egyptians that there was a chance at something, which led to the critical mass that we saw in the square, and that led to the kind of snowball effect that followed with the growing crowds that participated. But these movements and their success really convinced a lot of the region that the authoritarians who had controlled their respective countries for decades at a time could actually potentially be displaced. The lesson that a lot of those authoritarians took from that was that we need to be more violent so that we don't have the same fate as Ben Ali and Mubarak, and they were. And so that's part of why we've seen the situation that we observed in Syria and the violence in Bahrain, where they crushed the protests, and there was military intervention by our purported allies to assist them in crushing that protest and even torturing doctors who treated protesters. We played an active role in that, and also in the conflict in Yemen. And so there's the pushback was out of fear that this movement could continue across the region. But it also was a reminder of the fragility of these structures of government, right? I mean, 4 regimes fell in a matter of 6 months, in a very unpredictable, uneven, and at times violent way, which is not something you see in other systems of government, this kind of sudden collapse if there's a more robust set of institutions in place. And so, and that kind of is also tied to your question about the reaction to protests. The fact that protest is so dangerous, so risky, so high stakes elevates also the consequence of it potentially. And so it creates this kind of mechanism in which they cyclically feed each other. And so the more the government represses, the more the stakes of the protests rise, the more likely that even fairly small protests can create a crisis for these regimes, and results in overreactions that can spur even larger reactions on the part of the public, kind of action, reaction, action cycle. And so when you have a situation like we have now in Egypt, where we have more repression than has been witnessed since in its modern history, frankly. I mean, even people I know who lived under Nasser say that this is actually worse than that period in terms of repression, in terms of people being afraid to say anything to one another. The consequence of that was observable in 2019, where there was this brief moment where the collective action problem was resolved again. So I mean, since the counter-revolution, in 2013, the repression has resulted in a situation where the opposition can't organize. If it's in any sort of observable space, the government will repress it, will jail the people who are involved, and prevent any sort of mobilization from taking place. So in 2019, what happened was this contractor that had been working in the military, Muhammad Ali, who's now living in self-imposed exile in Spain, started producing videos about the corruption of the regime and about all these lavish palaces that the military was building for the president, presidential palaces, an elaborate 5-star hotel, etc. And everybody was watching this. And the reason you could be sure that everyone was watching it is that the president himself decided to respond to Muhammad Ali in remarks, and specifically preface those remarks with, "My advisors told me I shouldn't do this," and he probably should have listened to them. And so what continued was him saying very provocative things about, "Yes, absolutely, I'm building palaces, and in fact, I will be building more palaces because I'm building a new state, and that's what we have to do. But these palaces aren't for me. These presidential palaces are not for him, the president. They are for Egypt." And this was provocative. And so you have the situation where the president is provoking a population that's enduring growing levels of poverty. Everybody knows that everybody else is watching. Muhammad Ali calls for protests on September 19th, or September 20th, sorry, 2019. And observers like myself suspected that still we weren't going to see the protests because it was too scary a situation. But we did. Thousands of people across the country protested. Now, we're not talking about anything on the scale of what we observed in 2011, but it shook the regime. Those thousands of people out of 100 million actually spooked them. The president made, comments about, I hear you, and we need to make adjustments, and I'm going to add people to subsidy rolls. Parliament started to want to question ministers. There was this talk about a political opening that obviously did not happen. But why did 4,000 people out of 100 million scare the regime? Because of the memory of 2011, but B, because they knew that for 4,000 people, say, let's estimate it at that, to turn out and protest in the context of all of that repression and all of the consequences of fear of death or torture or imprisonment, they represented an enormous amount of anger behind them, and so many more people that wish they could protest. And so that elevated the stakes of the whole thing and made it something that created a crisis for the regime. And so that's the thing, is by winding everything so tight, they set themselves up for this perennial risk of crisis and unpredictable collapse potentially. And that's really the structural problem with this whole approach. The lesson that they learned from 2011 actually has created more fragility.
Right. So I want to turn this over to Linda, because you all have brought up something interesting, and that is that, so the protests in Tunisia and the eventual relatively quick overthrow there started with one man's protest, right? One man's frustration. Similarly, in Cairo, Dr. Amar, you remind us that, again, that movement started with one man's frustration. And I hate to say it, but in Syria, something began with the frustration of, expressed by children, but still the frustration of just little people on the ground who didn't seem to get a fair shake from their government. And that didn't go as well, right? That's where we're talking about kind of a brutal response, no room to breathe, no change, and an ensuing proxy war that has impacted the region and even brought Iran into the conversation. So Linda, I know you're familiar with that. I want you to touch on Syria if you can. And then also let us know what you think about Iran's position in the region, that their posture in the region, and incoming Biden administration. How does that impact the movements across the Arab world?
Well, thank you, Maryam. And I would like to acknowledge, I think Paul made an incredibly important point, that the protests may minimize what the tectonic plate change was here in the region. Civil society began to organize and move in a way that it had not before. Of course, the repression appears to have the upper hand, and I see no place more grim than Syria, as you invited me to make comments there, and I've spent a fair bit of time there. And I think that there's, unfortunately, the UN process, the Astana process that Russia's organized, no diplomatic pathway really appears likely to end the war there. And that is, I think, it's kind of a conundrum, because the US Congress has acted on the human rights front with the Caesar Act to try to call for some accountability and use levers of pressure against the enormous war crimes that have been committed. But tragically and ironically, that serves to really cement Assad in power. And I think Russia is really set up as something of the pivot point at this point. The US has espoused some maximalist objectives of regime change and also of the exit of Iran from the country, but it has not been able or willing to bring enough leverage to bear. It has a very small footprint in northeast Syria, trying to support the foothold of the Syrian Kurdish-led movement there, some hopes for them being able to reach an agreement and maintain some local governance in the areas where they dominate. I think where our report comes out, that I'll mention in a minute, but we believe the most urgent and feasible pathway is to really use whatever collective leverage available to press for more avenues for aid delivery, and to encourage in any kind of quid pro quo method more relief for the population, because there's a very critical, urgent situation, Idlib province as well as other areas. I'll pivot briefly to Iran, and this is where, from a U.S. policy standpoint, and our report, which was just published yesterday, we really make a case for a profound reorientation of U.S. policy in the region. In terms of where the administration is, there isn't a declared U.S. policy or strategy for the Middle East. There's really only a set of objectives with regard to Iran. I think that is going to be the focal point, and we've already clearly seen that with the initiative to re-enter the JCPOA, if Iran resumes its commitments, and to get a multilateral process back on track there. I think that's generally seen as hopeful, because at least it provides a venue for beginning to address not only the nuclear file, but also the other issues with Iranian behavior regarding regional destabilization and missile development and proliferation. That, I think it's safe to say, looking at the Biden team, where you have top officials that created the JCPOA agreement, in Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, Wendy Sherman over at State, and others, that you're going to see a concerted effort to try to get back to a diplomatic pathway. And then I would suggest that has some relevance for the situation of the Iranian people, insofar as there is less of a maximum pressure campaign, more of an opening for diplomacy that can lend support to the reformist factions within, and hopefully eventually some easing of pressures that allow a very vibrant population that I think wants nothing more than change to find that pathway forward. And let me finally just say, I think the pathways to change in each of these countries, there is not going to be one template. And I respect very much what Paul and Timothy have brought to this conversation, which is the bottom-up perspective. Our approach in our strategy document was really to try to put some specific change requirements out for U.S. policy, first and foremost to deal with the governments of the region in a different way, but also to pivot to people, so that really the measurement of whether we're helping the region is whether we're helping its people.
I want to pivot over to helping people, and I'm going to throw this over to Professor Amar in a second, but and this might be a difficult question, Linda, but I'm going to pose it. As far as the U.S. getting back into some sort of JCPOA commitment, and this idea that the United States has indicated an openness to speak, to talk again, provided that the Iranians go back to some of their commitments, do you think that Arab nations in the region look at that favorably? This idea that the United States is going to let Iran back into the international community. I mean, I know we like it. I know policy wonks talk about it being a good idea, but in the region, you know, given some of Iran's meddling, as we sort of simplistically like to call it, do the Arabs in the region really want to see the U.S. get back and play ball with Iran?
Part of what you said, and there may be other panelists that would like to say something, but I think it's very important, and I tried to indicate, it's not only the nuclear file. I think that really, to get support among the Arab partners in the region, the other main issues must be addressed, and that is the destabilization across the region. And you mentioned our modern political warfare study, which really had a number of case studies, but one looked at Iranian so-called soft power, but it's really quite adept at the use of creating militias and social movements and operating throughout the region to create these groups that can extend its power, but working in a very sophisticated way through populations. The other thing obvious, and this is, I think, for the Gulf states and witnessing the pretty dramatic missile attack on the Aramco refinery in Saudi Arabia. Iran is quite moved ahead in its missile development, and that is a primary concern of Gulf states. So I think the three have to be dealt with. The question is sequencing, and there's been a lot of debate over the best way to go forward. However, given that Iran has really leapt ahead in the nuclear enrichment and the whole consequence, I would argue, of the maximum pressure policy, which produced the opposite of what it intended to. There's a real urgency to get back to the nuclear talks as a first step, but have as part of the agenda dealing with these other two critical issues.
Okay, thank you. So, Dr. Amar, while we're focused on populations and sort of, reimagining how we deal with governments, I want to ask you, what are the likely allowances that each of these nations, Arab nations, that have experienced some form of protest or, on the ground organizing, what kind of allowances can they grant their populations without ceding too much power? In other words, what kind of reforms can be offered to placate restless populations that we've been talking about? And what kind of real reforms can these governments be expected to undertake to fundamentally address the grievances of their populations, most of which stem from a lack of employment, dead-end economies, a chronic failure of basic civil services that are not delivered on a regular basis to people? At what point do they actually have to think about some fundamental reforms that not just placate populations, but appease them in real ways?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a key question. So I think there's three sectors or areas in which these new forms of organization are struggling and making really some interesting innovation in terms of how to conceive of problems and how to solve them. So I'm lay out the three areas and then address how they can actually make some progress in those areas. So first, what I think is really amazing and innovative that has happened beginning with the moment of the Arab Spring, but continuing to become more substantive in this moment, is the shift from focusing on a sectarian lens for understanding political and social organization and toward a infrastructure and public services model for what the goals of the public sphere are. And that's becoming very explicit, as an anti-corruption movement in Iraq or in Lebanon, or the movements around trash and horrible sanitation in Lebanon or in Tunisia. The movements, so the language, it's not adopting the language of secular versus religious. It's critiquing the way that sectarianism actually creates a kind of constant proxy war in daily life, whether it's between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or whether it's between West and East, or it's between tradition and modernity. That binary has been suffocating. So instead, there's a focus, and it's not pragmatic because it ends up being very radical, a focus on public services, infrastructure, sanitation, and now, of course, health and public access to health, not fake health or, mafias running vaccine campaigns, but actual accountable public health. And I think that's revolutionary anywhere that happens. And the second is the shift to a focus, the shift in all parts of the Arab region on removing the military, the police, and private militia thug groups from the economy and from the public sector. There are so many businesses now run by military firms. The media and newspapers are run by police and intelligence agencies, and militias and armed thug groups, which we've become very familiar with in the United States in the last 2 months, are running businesses and protection rackets all up and down every country in this region. That is something that, of course, has been an intensifying reality after which produced the resentment of the Arab Spring, but then has become the dominant side of struggle since then. But making that a concrete set of proposals, which of course will be resisted very strongly by the actors in power, but which has become very articulate as a line of political organizing. So, and we in the United States got a glimpse of what it might be like if suddenly the military and the police were going to participate in one particular faction of an authoritarian political trajectory. And so we can identify with what that feels like if that were to be fulfilled. So I think we have those three areas: a shift from this battle between sectarianism and identity towards a shift toward public services and infrastructure. Second, a shift to get police, military, and militias out of the economy and out of the state. And third, a very important focus on labor and refugees, on migrant labor, which often makes up the majority of populations in Gulf countries and are often racialized or gendered and suffer terrible working conditions. And then second, refugee populations, which make up to half of the population of countries like Jordan and Lebanon, and which also suffer similar forms of almost racial, sometimes explicitly racial, and gender and sexual exploitation. In Egypt, there's is anti-Blackness and of course forms of race and sex prejudice, but what is even more generalized is the whole country has been spatially segregated into gated communities versus abandoned rural and urban territories where 98% of the population lives, and the government has been calling them thugs, has been calling them trash, has been calling them human pollution. So we have a government now that is only for the people living in these gated communities, and it's starting to treat its own population as if they're enemy immigrants in this very strange way. So I think in the United States we can identify with what's going on in this region, but I think I see a lot of not hope in terms of predicting it'll get better tomorrow, but I think the issues have been clarified in a beautiful way. Public services, get the military and police out of the economy, and focus on labor and refugees in a really non-racial, substantive way.
Great, thank you, Professor Amar. You alluded to mafia running healthcare, and I just wanted to say, just a couple of days ago, out of Lebanon came the news that vaccine rollout had been done in favorable ways to politicians versus the population. And so that brings me to you, Timothy. When and how can we expect governments to be answerable to their populations, held accountable to the people they serve, just as Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood was for just a fleeting moment, and goodness knows if it would have lasted, but for a moment in Egypt?
Sorry, I was muted. I guess with respect to the responsiveness of the Brotherhood, fundamentally it was about the distribution of power. It's not that the Brotherhood was uniquely democratic in its orientation or anything like that. Quite the contrary. It's that they were not as powerful as the current regime. And so when Morsi tried to place himself above judicial review, the Brotherhood president from 2012 to 13, there was mass protests and outcry, and he rescinded that decree. And in May, when he appointed a guy from Jamaat Islamiyah, a former terrorist organization, as governor of Luxor, again there was a massive outcry. A couple of weeks later, the guy was gone. There was the beginning of a process in which people were engaging in participatory democratic practice and learning how to hold their leaders to account. The challenge now is that they hold this kind of enormous control over the coercive apparatus of the state that makes it much more challenging to do this, much more dangerous to do this, of course. I don't know when that happens is certainly not something that anyone can prescribe or predict. I think that the question is, if we're talking about, I think it's more productive to talk about how can we help that happen as opposed to trying to determine a date for it. I think that there are many things that can be promoted on the part of the United States, particularly with its partners, that do not, in the view of the regimes that we're engaged with, pose what they would see as an existential threat to the regime, but at the same time create space for the public to breathe and to learn and to have opportunities to build some modicum of civil society organization and mobilization. Not necessarily, I think realistically, I mean, Egypt isn't going to become a liberal democracy anytime in the foreseeable future. I don't know that electoral contests will be of consequence anytime in the foreseeable future. I kind of doubt it, unless there's some dramatic rupture again. But what could happen is, I mean, there's a number of things. The crackdown on the press is something that we can take seriously in terms of our conditionality of assistance. I mean, we have tools already in our laws for withholding military aid and economic aid on the grounds of violations of human rights, but we don't enforce them. And so the lesson learned by these regimes is that we don't actually, it's not a priority. And in his call with the foreign minister of Egypt, Secretary Blinken said that from now on, security and human rights and democracy will be a priority. And I sincerely hope that goes beyond the rhetorical and becomes material. And in order for that to be material, in order for the Egyptians to even believe that, it has to affect the relationship. And that doesn't mean to like cut everything off right now. It means to have a transparent and frank conversation that if you want this, we need that. And this isn't just about, I think sometimes in Washington when we talk about this, we hear people viewing rights and freedoms as some sort of liberal luxury, or something that we can have at the end of our wish list, but not a fundamental priority in terms of our material interests. But the reality is that if we are so troubled by the possibility of the turmoil that we've seen for the last decade, if we are so worried about the stability of the region, then we need to appreciate that the extraordinary levels of repression currently observed are fundamental to that reality. And we can push in, I think, a strategic way to start to improve the governance dynamic in these places, to reduce the scale of the repression. I mean, we're not realistically going to get rid of all of it anytime in the foreseeable future, and the United States shouldn't be, realistically, neither the region nor Americans should think that U.S. is in the position to deliver like some dramatic reform in the region. It's more we should cease to be contributing to the problem, right? These
Perfect
are our
setup.
partners.
The perfect setup. I was going to say, thank you, Timothy. That's the perfect setup for Linda to tell us what the policy community, or RAND, is thinking the Biden administration can do looking ahead that might be a little bit different than what has been done over the last 100 years. And I agree with Timothy, and Professor Amar, all of you have mentioned this, how about more of a focus on people, on services, on supporting those on the ground movements that are springing up and could use some American support? How do we reimagine America in the Middle East?
Thank you. Yes, thank you. And Paul, that Timothy, that was very eloquent framing. I will not, I think, because you did such a good job, I'll just briefly say how our report, which is called Reimagining U.S. Strategy in the Middle East, critiques what we've been doing and really focus in a couple minutes here on some of the key recommendations. But the essence of the critique is that across U.S. administrations, policy toward the region has really been framed around what we call threatism, looking at the threat of the day, whether it's the Soviets, Arab nationalism, Islamic extremism, or countries like Iran. There's a threat, and that leads to enormous resources being poured into what we call keeping partners on our side, even if that conflicts with core U.S. objectives and values. And ultimately, that hasn't produced stability in the region and certainly hasn't served the people's needs. So we pivot to say the definition of stability really must be oriented around conflict reduction and addressing drivers of conflict, which necessitates improved governance and dealing with these deep socioeconomic challenges that I outlined at the outset. That doesn't, however, mean the U.S. can unilaterally force a democracy agenda on the region. And I think what part of the fatigue with the American public has been is an overly hubristic U.S. attitude that it can wave a wand and impose its will on the region. But what this report does say is we must not turn a blind eye to what is happening within the states that we partner with. And I think that what you have seen in the Biden administration's initial moves, but also I'd just like to call attention for those that follow Twitter, in between the election and the inauguration, both Jake Sullivan, who's now National Security Advisor, and Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, sent out a series of tweets that were pretty much solely focused on human rights. And I think that is clearly going to be a pillar of how they assess relationships. What our report recommends is that we rebalance U.S. policy to focus away from military tools in the U.S. policy arsenal to non-military tools. Number two, that we take a long-term approach, because a lot of these fundamental problems will take time to address, and we don't want to have policy fatigue. And number three, work with regional and international partners so we have a combined effect. People, I think, are not really aware of the fact that half of all U.S. security assistance and sales goes to the Middle East, and the imbalance within what we do give to the region is equally severe. The last year's budget request for the Middle East, 83% of it was for military aid. So we propose shifting that balance to state and U.S. Agency for International Development programs on economic development, economic reforms, governance, education, and critically, the humanitarian aid file and support to a record level of refugees. We would rebalance aid from the focus on the big three that receive over 80% of U.S. foreign military financing, and then introduce more selectivity in which countries and programs receive aid. I'd like to note the U.S. Congress has actually been moving in this direction. The past administration tried to radically cut state and USAID budgets, and Congress rejected that. It also legislated something called the Global Fragility Act that requires a more focused and coordinated approach in the assistance programming to avoid overspending and waste. And what we specifically recommend is a compact with the recipient governments and an agreement on what the goals are and a commitment to rigorously evaluate them. And we've been involved at RAND in lots of these program evaluations. And what's critical is once you do a rigorous evaluation, then decisions really need to flow from that about future aid. So we have a series of very detailed recommendations that we think start policy moving in the right direction with the resources we have. And then we have a series, just to end, I won't go into them. Multilateral diplomacy is very important as part of a non-military emphasis to policy in the region.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Linda. Thanks to all of you. Timothy, I'm sure I'll give you, so we are going to go to audience questions. I am heartened to hear, Linda, your suggestions for a new U.S. reimagining of Middle East policy. I think everyone on this call has probably for years been saying, let's invest more in people than in military. So that's heartening for all of us to hear. I know Timothy has something to say because we talked about it in our conversation, but I'm hoping the questions will draw it out. Jessica, I'm going to hand this over to you for questions. Yes?
Great, thank you so much. And for those of you that are asking about Linda's report, if you check in the chat, I did share a link to that report with you, so go ahead and check that out. The first question we have, to what extent will the openings of Arab states with Israel impact the Arab Spring process? I don't know which one of you might want to jump in on that question.
Can we give it to Timothy so he can also make his point? Quickly, Timothy.
Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, they're actually connected. So I suspect, to be honest with you, that it won't do much to advance the efforts at moving towards more democracy. It actually will probably make it easier for the governments that are normalizing with Israel to call on Congress to keep pressure low on them. So there's a lot of authoritarian governments that have been making these normalization deals, the Emirates, Bahrain, and this is what's vitally important. For the U.S. to credibly advance a rights agenda and say that this is a priority, it has to be with its allies and its adversaries. It's really a huge problem right now that many people perceive this rights advocacy as a political tool versus a credible principle.
Thank you so much. Linda, I'll direct this one to you on economics. I hear relatively little discussion about how to expand jobs in the area. Saudi Arabia, despite all its problems, seems to be thinking about this. What are all nations doing in this regard, especially given foreseeable longer-term demise of fossil fuel dominance? And what should the U.S. role be?
Thank you. Yes, well, I'll start first with U.S. policy because there are many tools in the toolkit and we go through them in fair detail, but trade and investment, foreign investment treaties, multilateral and bilateral, I mean, there are a lot of levers that isn't just the giving and the taking of aid, and that's very important in the context of Gulf states and others that don't actually need U.S. assistance, but there are ways to incentivize policy change. The big driver, I think, is this requirement for the energy, the oil and gas dependent economies to diversify. And there's also the driver of climate change. Now, you may say these are long-term drivers, but they're real. And those new economies that I think the UAE is is the farthest ahead, but it's a knowledge economy. And I referred to earlier the job, the skills education mismatch with the job market. There's a real need for a new economy to develop in these countries, and frankly, the most populous countries are the ones that are in dire need of it. And I lament to see, and again, I'll refer to Iraq because there is a country, it's really tragic. They have great resources, 5th largest oil reserves in the world, and they can't even give electricity to all of their population. So I do not want to minimize the amount of reform that is required. And the US, if we could again get off the threadism and start seeing these conditions as actually the true problem that we need to tackle, I think there's every reason to gain buy-in from a number of these countries to start supporting the fundamental reforms they need to undertake. And it means moving away from public sector jobs that are doled out to political parties to keep a given party in power.
Thank you. This questioner says, why is President Biden wrong to want to deprioritize the Middle East in terms of foreign policy and US attention? It's been 10 years since the Arab Spring, and the status quo is the same. Until the Arab people really get serious about changing the dictators who control their lives, the best anyone in the West can hope for is small incremental change. What evidence is there that any of the major Arab countries are going to evolve in a meaningful way internationally?
I suggest we give that to Professor Amar.
Well, I think it's an opportunity for our viewers and also for the public across the United States to really think about engaging not just through the vehicle of foreign policy, but really joining in different ways of learning and connecting with alternative media and alternative knowledge and alternative arts coming out of the Middle East, because I think that's where we can get beyond the pessimism and the frustration that we all feel. There's amazing alternative news magazines online, Jadaliya, JADALIYYA.com, and Mada Masr, where Timothy has published before, MADA, Mada Masr, MASR. And also I don't know what stage people are in their terms of thinking about classes and participating in arts programs, but during lockdown is a great time to start learning some Arabic or some Farsi. So my point is not to dodge the question, but to think about us in the United States as having a kind of grassroots connection to what's going on beyond the movements of states and dictators, but so we can get to know what's happening in the social imaginaries of people in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Lebanon, the arts, the new graphic novels. The Netflix now has an entire platform of fantastic shows in Arabic with US subtitles, fantastic Egyptian shows on science fiction. So I just invite people not to get frustrated and to just think about authoritarianism and repression, but to reconnect with the Middle East in a creative way, in an exciting way, because that's where you're going to see hope and that's where you're going to see the future.
Thank you. Linda, you wanted to add to that?
I'd just like to add, I think that also educational exchanges, I think getting back into that flow is so critical, and removing things like the Muslim ban. I mean, I think that we really have to leap ahead in people-to-people programs. But I would like to say, and I appreciate the questioner's comment, because we are not proposing a massive Marshall Plan. We are proposing that we rebalance away from heavy military, just unbelievably heavy focus on military assistance and sales, to programs that are of proven value and that we ensure there's a return on those investments, because we've learned a lot about just throwing wads of money. I've done a lot of work in post-conflict stabilization, Iraq, somewhat Syria, really Afghanistan. We now know what wrong looks like. There's been a lot of learning around that. But I would like to say there is a slice. We think that offensive and escalatory weaponry is not the solution, but there is a call for some defensive support in the security realm, but moreover, security cooperation done right can incentivize professional security forces. And we have learned some critical lessons there, and that can incentivize governments as well. So I don't want to suggest that we're going from 83% to 0 on the security file, but it's a very narrow band of things that actually produce positive results in security for the countries.
Thank you. Timothy, I'm going to direct this question to you. What problem, if any, will the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam have on Egypt?
Potentially a lot. Negotiations have been going for on and off for technically a decade and robustly for the last 6 years. But unfortunately, there's really been very little progress. The Ethiopians are understandably very suspicious of the Egyptians and don't really want to make concessions to them because Egypt for decades has prevented them from being able to develop anything on the Nile. At the same time, Egypt has a legitimate concern that the reduction of flow that could potentially be caused by the dam would result in the desertification of arable land and the accelerated salination of the Nile Delta, which is also a hugely important area of farmland in Egypt. And this is a country that already has a massive water scarcity problem. So it's a serious long-term risk to Egypt's vital interests.
Thank you. And this will be my final question since I know we're right at the end of the hour. The Arab Spring began in response to oppressive regimes and a low standard of living, with protests in Tunisia and 5 other countries. Rulers were deposed or killed. Was the movement successful or a wasted effort?
I have a feeling you're each going to say it's ongoing. I don't know, Timothy, if you can do it quickly, then we'll let everybody get a bite on that, because I have a feeling, yeah, it's not over yet.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think the reality is that as the protests in 2019 showed, the grievances haven't been addressed, and so the process continues. I think thinking of political phenomenon as some sort of event that begins and ends is an incorrect structure of analysis. A cartoonist on the eve of the anniversary of the uprising in Egypt this year was arrested after posting a video saying, "We continue." And I think that the reality is that this is a continual process, and people are learning. There's a growingly vocal feminist movement in Egypt that's fighting against sexual harassment and sexual assault and using social media. It's an ongoing process, and people's inspiration to act and to make demands has not abated. It's ongoing.
Dr. Amar?
Sure. No, I mean, I think that what was hugely successful in 2011-12 was not necessarily the revolutions against the leaders of the states, but a revolution in consciousness and a revolution in the imaginary of what politics is, the things that we've all been talking about today in terms of how people understand their right to make their own histories and the tactics in which they're going to reshape public space, the economy, how they see the identity, whether it's around sectarianism or around the public sphere. So I think that revolution still has a great impact. It's changed the conversation for every public in the Middle East. We've been following, as Linda's been talking about, we've been focusing so much upon the sectarian proxy war, between this country and that, and we've seen that as a military question overwhelmingly. But that's not necessarily how people on the ground have seen the last 10 years. It's been a continuous struggle around the media, the social media, around sanitation and services, around the dignity of our bodies as they are seen through gender or race or as workers or as migrants. And I think in the United States, we get that same 10-year change in consciousness, and we've been a part of that. So we're connected to those same historic grand shifts in the narrative of citizenship and politics. So that's a revolution, and that the fact that it is so profound and so inspiring is why we have repression at this scale. It's not because of it, it's because of its success in changing the possibilities of a different future.
Linda, I think you get the last word on this.
Opportunity to be with these two fine panelists and the audience. I would echo what Paul just said. A transition from identity politics to issue politics, I think, is underway, and it's very much tied to the generational change. And I do believe that societies change at a generational pace, sometimes slower than others, but in the last 20 years, I've been focused on the MENA region in South Asia. I'm constantly remembering my first decade of my career in Latin America, and everyone said that region did not have a democratic vocation. Dictatorships were then racked by insurgencies, and guess what? They made a transition, not problem-free, not problems solved. But I do believe that the people of the region will continue to press. And as you said, Maryam, this story is far from over.
Thank you all so much for doing this discussion with us today. Maryam, thanks for spearheading this talk as well. We hope to have you back to join us when we can actually do events in person. And Maryam, I'll turn this back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you, LA World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you to my three formidable panelists. Like we said in the beginning, I think the emerging theme from this conversation is probably reimagining, not just reimagining US foreign policy in the region, but reimagining how we see that population, how we as Americans view the population in the Middle East, maybe changing, not to, have it transform to be not a behemoth of just people who are unable to govern themselves and, in perpetual conflict, but people who are pining for the same sets of freedoms and public services and stability that the rest of us want, and maybe it's been a whole lot of meddling, or maybe it's been a lot of militarizing, or maybe it's been a lack of education, or even their own lack of reimagining their own societies. But there is no reason why the Middle East can't transform, and there is no reason why that young population can't find a way to forge a new Middle East as they look ahead. And I hope the United States will be a partner. Thanks to each of you for joining this conversation.